Welcome for all our students in the second grade of the secondary stage. We will start now the story of Gulliver, Chapter 1. Before I begin my story, I would like to tell you a little about my early life. I was born on a large farm in the middle of England, the third of 5 sons, and my father called me Lemuel Gulliver. After I finished school, I studied in Cambridge for 3 years and then became apprenticed to a surgeon in London. The surgeon, Mr. Bates, was a very good one, and I worked with him for 4 years. However, I always wanted to travel, so in my free time I learned how to sail so that one day I could leave England and explore the world. He is here talking about himself and introducing himself, about his name, what his education, what he wants to do. Mr. Bass knew all about my desire to travel, so when I had finished my studies, Mr. Bass helped me to get work as a surgeon on a ship called the Swallow. For 3.5 years, I worked for Captain Abraham Pennell on his ship as it traveled around the eastern seas. Gulliver here talking about Mr. Bates, introducing Mr. Bates as a good man. After that, he talking about his work with Abraham Pennell on the ship called the Swallow. Once back in England, I met a kind woman called Mary Burton, and we soon got married. I decided to stay in London with my new wife for a few years. But although Mr. Bates did all he could do to help me, work wasn't easy to find. A year later, Mr. Bates sadly died, and I knew that my life would only become more difficult. We had only just enough money to live on. Gulliver talking here about 2 important events in his life. The first one, how he met his wife, Mary Burton. The second one, a sadly event, that Mr. Bates' death. There is little work for a surgeon in London, but my friends tell me I should be able to find work on a ship. I said to Mary one day. She thought long and hard before saying, I don't want you to go, but if that's the only way we can earn enough to live well, then so be it. Gulliver here talking about his difficulty life for earning enough money for living with his wife. His friends tell him to working on a ship, but his wife was so sad. My friends were right, because I quickly found another job as a ship's surgeon, and for 6 years I traveled around the world. I earned good money, and as a surgeon is not always needed on a ship, I also had plenty of time to myself. I didn't waste this time, but used it well. I read books, and taught myself to speak several languages. Gulliver here talking about his new job, and how he earned money from it. Besides, he didn't waste his time as learning new languages and reading books. My life changed after I got a new job on a ship called the Antelope. We left England in May, and we had been at sea for about 2 months. When the Antelope was hit by a violent storm, the ship was soon blown far away from our chosen route, and we didn't know where we were. The sea was so violent that we lost some of our crew even before the ship was suddenly blown onto a rock. There was a terrible crash, and I could see that the ship was in great danger. We are going to sink, shouted the captain. Get into the lifeboats. Gulliver here talking about his new job on a ship called the Antelope, and he's talking about Antelope that it was a crash, and after that they were going to sink. Quickly climbing into a lifeboat with 5 other sailors, I was able to escape, but not everyone was lucky. We watched in horror as the Antelope sank behind us. But although we rowed for some distance, the sea didn't become calmer. A huge wave hit us and we were all thrown into the water. He's talking here about big disaster of sinking. He's not alone, with 5 other sailors trying to survive. The sea was raw, and it was very hard to swim in my heavy clothes, but at least the water was not too cold. I looked around me and realized that I was alone. I didn't know what had happened to the other sailors. Perhaps they were all dead. The wind and the waves decided the direction I went in, and I soon felt I had lost all the strength in my arms. Just when I thought I couldn't swim anymore, my feet touched something hard. I had reached land. When I finally waked up the beach, I was cold, wet and exhausted. I looked around me, but there were no houses or people that I could see. So I found some soft grass, lay down, and fell into a long sleep. As we can see here in this passage, Gulliver is surviving, but alone. When I woke up, it was early morning, and the sun was just beginning to rise. I tried to stand up, but I found that this was impossible. I realized that my arms, my legs, and even my hair were all somehow fastened to the ground. Then ropes were tied around my body and neck, and I found I could only look up at the clear sky above me. Okay, Gulliver here, when he opened his eyes, he found himself tied with ropes on the ground. His hand, his leg, even his hair, so of course he can't move. I heard some noises and then felt something climb onto my left leg. It moved up my body until it was close to my head. Only then could I see what it was. It was a human, but this human was only about 15 centimeters tall. He was carrying a bow and arrow. I then realized there were about 40 other men of the same size around me. They all looked the same, each one carrying a tiny bow and arrow. "Who are you, and what are you doing to me?" I cried. On hearing my voice, the little men looked worried and jumped away from me. So I tried to stand up again. Some of the ropes broke and now I could move my left arm. In this passage, Gulliver found himself tied on the ground. So he wondered who can make this to him. When he looked around, he found a little man beside him. In this passage, Gulliver found himself tied on the ground. So he wondered who can make this to him. When he looked around, he found a little man beside him. Then Gulliver didn't find any way to escape, but he moved to cut the ropes. Finally, he can move his left hand. The little man shouted something in a strange language, and I felt hundreds of arrows hit me. Most of the arrows hit my thick clothes, and I felt nothing. But some of them stuck in my left hand. The arrows were tiny, but there were so many of them that it hurt. "Will you please stop that?" I shouted. But when they continued to shoot the arrows, I lay quietly on the ground and decided not to move or say anything. If I waited until night time, I thought I could use my left hand to untie the other ropes and escape when it was dark. Gulliver here trying to find the way to escape, but the small little man threw hundreds of arrows toward him until he fallen down again. But he planned to untie the ropes with his left hand and escape at night. The man said something to his servants. I watched as some of the little men went off, returning shortly with many baskets of food and little containers of water. They put ladders against my shoulder and carried the baskets and containers up to my mouth. They couldn't believe how much I drank and ate, but they seemed pleased. I think the little people realized that they could trust me, and with food in my stomach, I felt I could trust them too. Finally, the man understood what Gulliver wanted to say, and the little men bring to Gulliver many baskets full of food and containers full of water. "Thank you," I said when I had finished eating. The little men smiled at me and nodded their heads. Another man arrived, and it was clear that this was an important person. The other men bowed to him, and from his clothes I understood that this was the king of their country. which I later found was called a Lilliput. He too spoke to me from the wooden platform, and I waited patiently until he finished speaking. After Gulliver finished his eating, he felt that the little man was happy and not being scared from him anymore. Then Gulliver knew that important man is their king from his clothes. Perhaps because they could see that I wasn't trying to escape, the little men became quiet. Later, they grew more confident, and after about an hour, I could hear wood being cut next to me. I guessed that they were building something. Then the ropes around my head were cut free, and I could finally lift my head. I saw a man standing on a wooden platform that had been built to the side of my head. The man was wearing important-looking clothes, and a servant stood on each side of him. He looked at me and started to give a talk, but I couldn't understand anything he said. I guessed from his expressions and intention that he spoke with a mixture of threats and promises. Gulliver here describing his situation with the strange little men, and when they sure that he can't move or escape, they felt more comfortable, and bring an important man from them to say some threats and promises. But Gulliver didn't understand anything from he said. When the man finished talking, I tried to talk to him in English. Sir, my name is Lemuel Gulliver, and my ship's been lost in a storm. That's why I'm here. You don't need to tie me up. I won't hurt anyone. Perhaps you could give me some food and a drink. I could see from his expression that he didn't understand me either. So I pointed to my mouth to show him that I was hungry and thirsty. Gulliver explained for the man with his hand pointing for his mouth that he is hungry and thirsty, because the man didn't understand what Gulliver said. I am pleased to meet you, sir, but please can you set me free? I asked him. I now knew we couldn't speak the same language, but we managed to communicate with each other using signs with our hands. So I understood that he refused my request to be free, and that he said that I didn't need to worry. He pointed and said something about moving me somewhere. Gulliver asked from the king to set him free with signs, but he felt that he refused his request, but he will move him somewhere. Hundreds of tiny people were now standing around me. Slowly they picked me up and put me on a strange machine that had many wheels. Later I found out that the people of this land were great engineers and had designed the machine to carry heavy trees. It was pulled by a team of tiny black and white horses, each horse about 11 centimeters tall. I realized that they wanted to take me to the capital city before we left. Some of the men poured some medicine on the cuts where the arrows had hit my hand. The cuts immediately felt much better. Gulliver explained the tiny people kindness with him, and how much they intelligent build a great machines to carry a heavy trees. The city was perhaps a kilometer away, but it took all that night for the machine to carry me there. Because they had put some medicine in my food that made me sleepy, I slept for most of the journey, only waking up briefly when one of the soldiers decided to put a pole up my nose to see what would happen. He quickly ran away when I woke up and sneezed. Gulliver explained the long journey with the tiny people, and he knew that they put a medicine in his food to make him sleep. Then he woke up after sneeze. The next morning, I woke to find that the machine had carried me to an area close to the city gates. The horses stopped outside the building, which I later found out was an ancient temple, the largest building in the land. No one used the empty building now, so the king decided that I should stay there. The building had a small garden around it, which you could enter through 2 gates, each one a little more than a meter high. The king didn't want me to escape, so he asked some of his men to fasten my legs to the gates using metal chain. Gulliver here tells us about the tiny people. They took him to an empty building in an ancient temple. The king didn't want him to escape, so he ordered from his men to fasten his legs to the gates with metal chains. Opposite my new home there was a tower which was approximately 2 meters high. The king went to the top of this tower with his men so they could watch me like you watch an animal in a zoo. Although I couldn't see them, during the next few days, hundreds of people from the city came out of the gates to see me laying on the strange machine next to my new home. At first, they used ladders to try to climb up on my body, but the king said this was not allowed. Gulliver described the tower that front of his new home, and continued saying that the king and so many people came to watching him as a strange animal in a zoo when he is lying on the strange machine. When the soldiers realized I couldn't escape with my legs chained to the gates, they cut the ropes that fastened me to the machine. Now I could stand up, although the chains on my legs stopped me from going very far. However, I could walk a little way around the empty building, and at night I could lie down to sleep on the hard floor of my new home. After the soldiers trusted of Gulliver, they cut the ropes that fastened him to the machine, so he can stand up and walk, but can't go so far, because of the legs chains, and he had a hard floor to sleep. The next morning I got up and looked at the land around the city. It was a pretty scene, which reminded me of a painting in a children's book. There were lots of little fields and woods, the fields the size of small gardens, and the trees only a little more than 2 meters tall. I watched as some men arrived with little vehicles, which they pushed towards me on wooden wheels. Each vehicle carried food and drink, and the men left the vehicles at the point to which I could walk before the chain stopped me. I emptied 20 of these vehicles for my breakfast. I didn't know what the food was, but it tasted nice. Gulliver here described the beautiful nature shapes that he saw at the city. The city had fields with small gardens. Then he continued. The tiny people came with vehicles full of food. The food was unknown, but it tasted good. As I saw eating, I realized the king was watching me with his servants and some of his family. He was about 28 years old and tall compared to the other people, with strong arms and handsome face. His clothes were the same as a king would wear in European country. Although he held up a sword to protect himself, it was perhaps 7 centimeters long. He spoke to me again in a very high voice. "I am sorry, Your Majesty," I replied, "but I cannot understand what you are saying to me." I tried to answer in all the languages I knew, French, Spanish, Chinese, and Arabic, but he understood nothing. Gulliver describes the tiny people's king, and he was so small. Then, when he tried to speak with him again, in all languages he knew, he also didn't understand him. After the king left, people from the city began to arrive to look at me again. Some of the braver people tried to climb on my body, but the guards stopped them. One morning, I was sitting down by the door of my new house, watching the little people who had come to see me. 6 of them approached me with bows and arrows. They started shooting arrows at me, and one arrow nearly hit my eye. The people again and again went to watching him as a strange creature. "That's not funny," I shouted at them. "Stop it at once." Seeing that I was angry, the guards quickly arrested the 6 people who had done this. They tied their hands together and pushed them towards me, perhaps thinking that I could punish them. They all looked very worried. "So why are you shooting at me?" I asked as I picked them up one at a time. "You 5 can wait here in my pocket," I said, holding the 6th man in my hand. I looked at him with interest. Laughing, I said to him, "You are so small and so very weak." I picked up a knife and moved it towards the little man's hands. "You think I'm going to eat you, don't you?" I said. The little man and even the guards look horrified. Gulliver here doing that with the 6 small people, especially the one who hid his eyes to scare them. And what he can do, we will know in the next chapter. Goodbye.